Before imperialism, the islands of Indonesia were made up of many kingdoms, with a king or prince ruling it, meaning that the kingdoms had a monarchy. In addition, the nations had different religions and cultures. For example, by the 1400s, the majority of the kingdoms were Muslim nations. However, there were still a few Hindu nations as well, such as on the island of Bali. Before the appearance of Islamic states, there were many great nations. Of those kingdoms, the Majapahit kingdom is thought to be the greatest of them all. The climate in Indonesia was ideal for agriculture, which is why a lot of Indonesians lived in rural areas as farmers and grew cash crops such as rice, corn, coffee, sugar, and spices. A lot of the trade was agricultural. The huge variety of the spices that grew in Indonesia made the country valuable to the European. Trade with India, China, and the mainlands of Southeast Asia resulted in a lot of religious and cultural influence on Indonesia. Earlier in its history, Indonesia had a majority Hindu population, again due to Indian traders. Later, however, Indian Muslim traders began spreading Islam, beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries. As a result, by the end of the 13th century, the first Islamic states had been established, and by the time the imperialists arrived, Islam was the dominant religion in Indonesia, with Hinduism as a minority. Many Indonesians lived in dwellings with floors of pounded earth or raised wood, and walls made of bamboo matting, supporting roofs of dried palm fiber or wood. In regards to education before imperialism, a type of Islamic boarding school existed called Pondok Pesantren. Many of these schools were established and continue to teach today.
The Dutch East India Company, also known as VOC, had colonized Indonesia under the British gained control of it. The Dutch were interested in gaining control of the spice trade that went on in Indonesia. Spices included nutmeg, coffee, indigo, cinnamon, tea, and sugar. Some of these were introduced by the Dutch, which instantly became cash crops. Nutmeg is one of the most expensive spices found, and one small bag could probably buy a house in London. Most Indonesians were in the spice business, whether it was just selling them outside of their houses or in a big export business. Different spices came from different parts of the islands, and special tools were used to navigate to these islands, and only specific captains and sailors knew how to get there. The Dutch gained control from the Portuguese because they could not maintain the spice trade, and the Dutch East India Company captured it. They did this by defeating them at a naval war. Not only did they gain Indonesia, but it also showed they were enemies for each other's benefits. The Dutch were obviously not welcomed, and although many small rebellions took place, these were not enough to drive the Dutch out. They were feared and not popular in many towns. However, the Dutch left behind many legacies like architectural structures which have wiped out the traditional way of homes. Government in Indonesia under the Dutch was very cruel and unjust. They ruled with a mix of biased constitutional monarchy and military dictatorship. This helped them keep the Indonesians under control and helped maintain what was most important to them, the financial income from the spice trade.
Imperialism in Indonesia was from 1680 to 1800. It was brought by the Europeans and had many social, political, and economical effects on the Indonesians. Socially, the Europeans expanded, created a new population and many new ethnics. But on the negative side, this was forcing the natives to give up their original values to follow the new systems and laws. Politically, there was an increased rise of nationalism, and this led to a nationalistic movement of natives to support Indonesia. Economically, the Indonesians were forced to work for the Europeans and follow the cultivation system, which forced farmers to pay revenue to the treasury for the Netherlands in the form of export crops for compulsory labor. The Europeans also abused power by selling products the natives made in the profits that they did not deserve. There are many events in Indonesia, but the most important is the Java War, Japan taking over Indonesia and Indonesian independence. The Java War, from 1825 to 1830, was conflict between the Dutch administration and the Javanese rulers and peasantry of the interior. Then, during World War II, Japan had their eye on Indonesia's oil, which was vital to war effort. Japan tolerated fledgling nationalists such as Sukarno throughout the war. Sukarno helped with Indonesia's freedom after Japan had surrendered. Indonesia's independence was declared by its inhabitants on August 17, 1945, but the Dutch refused to acknowledge their separation until December 1949. In Java, the Dutch administration had decreed new agricultural policies that had upset the balance between Javanese rulers and peasantry and the Dutch. The rebellion was led by Diponegoro, a Javanese prince, in 1825. The immediate cause for his revolt was the construction of a road over his ancestor's grave, but the wider cause for the conflict was the general disapproval of the Dutch administration. The rural population and the aristocracy supported the revolt and provided much greater amounts of resources. Although they had plenty of supplies, the Dutch colonial army proved to be strong in the fields too. Diponegoro started a guerrilla campaign until 1830, which he was forced to surrender. The Javanese people suffered the loss of 200,000 people, and the Dutch lost 15,000 soldiers.
The Dutch ruled Indonesia, or at the time it was known as the Dutch East Indies. But when World War II arrived, Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies and took over, putting Sukarno, an important Indonesian nationalist, in charge. Japan wanted control of Indonesia because of its natural resources, especially its oil. Indonesia's oil was a necessity to the Japanese army to supply itself for the war, along with other vital raw materials. That was why on March 1942, the Japanese took Indonesia away from the Dutch, and Sukarno welcomed them. With Sukarno being in charge, he constantly pressed Japan for Indonesia's independence. But when Japan became weak, he hesitated at first to officially gain independence until he was pushed by youth activists. That was when he declared Indonesia's independence on August 17, 1945. He then became Indonesia's first president. At the beginning of his presidency, the Dutch tried to recontrol Indonesia twice after World War II, but they failed their attempts at reclaiming power. As a result of imperialism, major political events have occurred that affected Indonesia's history. Sukarno was Indonesia's first president, but he soon became corrupt with his power and turned into a dictator. He first decided to change the economic and political systems to control democracy and control the economy. And because of his negative turn in ruling, many wanted him dead, and he constantly had to escape assassination attempts from multiple people. Secondly, he doubled the cost of living, which greatly harmed the natives. Lastly, Sukarno withdrew Indonesia from the United Nations as a result of his hatred towards Malaysia. Soon, the incident of the coup of 1965 happens and causes major changes. A group of people known as the September 30th movement kidnap and kill 6 major generals. These killings caused great shock around the whole nation, and everyone wanted to know who was responsible for it. The Indonesian Communist Party, supported by Sukarno, believed that it was the military who had done this, which was ruled by Suharto, while the military thought the opposite. At the end, the military succeeded in putting the blame of the deaths on Sukarno, and soon Sukarno lost his power and position as president, which was taken over by Suharto. While the two parties were fighting, an estimate of 80,000 to 1 million communists were killed by the military, and not long after Sukarno died. When he was buried, Sukarnoism was buried with him, but not for long. Suharto also turned out to be a dictator as well, and ruled for 30 years. Due to tyranny and dictatorship after imperialism, long-term impacts were made that have changed the course of everyday life for the common people of Indonesia. When rulers such as Sukarno and Suharto have ultimate control of Indonesia, they are too corrupt with power to care about the common good for the people. When Sukarno had the money to help benefit the organization of the newly independent nation, he instead spent the money on extravagant parties and banquets with music, dancing, and other entertainments. This resulted in Indonesia's economic instability, which eventually led to inflation, causing Indonesia's currency to drop in value. Despite all the negative impacts that have happened as a long-term effect of imperialism, some positive things came out as well. With Indonesia's independence, the country has greatly excelled in health, education, as well as cultural awareness and cultural self-expression. Not only that, but everyone had national pride. Every citizen, whether poor or rich, high in society or not, everyone was proud to be an Indonesian.